I'm going to take you through the Armageddon game between Levon Aronian and Magnus Carlsen from round 2 of the Norway Chess tournament. Remember, if you want to support the channel, then please do check out the links to PayPal or Patreon.com. And if you want to subscribe to the channel, then do click on the button below. So, this game, wow, this was extraordinary because in the classical game, Levon had been that close to beating Magnus. He made a misstep in a rook and pawn endgame and turned a winning position into a drawing one. And Magnus, by the skin of his teeth, hung on to make a draw. So that meant they went into an Armageddon game. So that means that Aronian with the white pieces was in a must-win situation. Let's see what happened. So Aronian opened with e4. He seems to have, well, he switches back and forth between this and c4. And Magnus still going for his knight c6 Sicilian, which was met by bishop b5 from Aronian. And here Aronian followed the trend of taking the knight with the bishop. You can just castle there. And you might recall this from the Caruana-Carlsen World Championship match. And, well, other games that Magnus has played as well. I think Magnus is very, very comfortable with this kind of position because he enjoys a fixed pawn structure. And he likes the two bishops as well. Incidentally, they had this in the classical game. Magnus played with queen c7 a little bit earlier. And found himself in a difficult position. But anyway, he's played differently in this Armageddon game. And now knight e7, queen e7 and normal. Queen c7 is a little bit unusual from Magnus. He's just waiting to see how white commits before he commits his king's knight. And now he gets out quickly and castles. So allowing Aronian to get in b4, which is strategically quite nice for white, because after this exchange, then it opens the a file, and white has this nice central pawn mass. But, well, Carlsen isn't bothered about that. He played f5. A few years ago, Magnus won an absolutely wonderful game against Caruana in the Tata Steel tournament. You might recall I did a video on that game. Hopefully you can find the link elsewhere to that. And Magnus won with a beautiful kingside attack which involved this pawn storm. Well, watch what happens here. It's almost like a repeat. Bishop e6. Around about here, probably Levon's doing okay. A good move is queen c1. Let's have a quick look. To try and swap the bishops, which of course would weaken the e5 pawn. And after this, the bishop will come round to c3 to attack e5. And there isn't time to get in g5 and knight g6 to support that pawn. That's crucial. So black would end up having to take on c4. It's not completely satisfactory. After queen c1, you can also take here. And, well, this is very double-edged as well. But at least white has very nice positions for the knight. But in the game, knight g5 was played. And this allows Magnus to get in this big pawn wedge. So here it's a very different situation. A couple of moves ago, in that queen c1 variation, it wasn't possible for black to set up like this. You can see that the e-pawn is securely protected. And that means that the knight has been able to find this nice square on g6. And black is also ready just to smash open the g file. And then that bishop that has no opponent is going to come into play on these diagonals. And that is already very, very unpleasant. let me just show you a funny variation here. Levon played d4, which is, I think, a very good move to counterattack in the centre of the board. But let's just see what happens if white plays knight h2. Now, I don't think this is a good move because I think it's too passive. But the problems that white has in this variation are that, remember, Carlsen with black only needs a draw to get the points. And in a variation like this, the problem is that after f3, you close the queen's retreat. And here, black can't trap the queen, but you can keep hitting it and it has no escape. Basically, it'll be a draw by repetition. So it's the kind of thing that white always, or Aronian always has to have in his head in this Armageddon game. Anyway, d4 is quite reasonable. Nevertheless, Carlsen still gets in g4, and that lovely light squared bishop causes huge problems for white with this pin. Objectively, white is still okay, but it's not an easy position for white to play. Much easier for black to play because black is on the attack. Black has the initiative here. Now, if black can get some firepower drilling down the g file, black just needs to play king h8, rook g8, could be all over very quickly. So it's essential that Aronian finds counterplay, and he did find it with knight d6. King h8, of course, shuffling the king out of the way, ready potentially to get a rook to g8. At this point, clock times were Aronian 4 minutes 20 remaining, Carlsen 3 minutes 22. Remember, they started out with Aronian 10 minutes, Carlsen 7. So even by this stage, although Aronian has still a minute time advantage on the clock, things are evening up. Now, as I said, rook g8 and knight h4, very, very dangerous threats. So it's essential that Aronian reacts. It's interesting, if Carlsen were to take that pawn, so black has a pawn up now, but that completely changes the assessment of this position. Because suddenly this knight can't get to h4. These rooks are actually somewhat stymied on the f-file. And white's major pieces look superb. Potential for the rook to come down here, rook here. Even though white is a pawn down, fantastic compensation because black's attack has gone. But Carlsen was wise to that. And quite quickly, he sacrificed the exchange and played knight h4, which here, well, is almost mate on the spot because this is a threat. Obviously, there's a pin here, the queen goes. But in fact, Aronian does have a saving move, and I think, well, basically he'd invested the time to make sure that he could actually save the position with f6. Very important move. So, queen takes, has to be taken. And by this stage, Aronian only had 1 minute 50 remaining. Carlsen had 2:39. So now Carlsen had a time edge on the clock. Now, if the king ducks out, let's say king h1, then this is mate. This is very nice, actually. After this, black plays rook g8. Remember, you've got to be very careful because there's a potential check here. Whoops, I misfired again. Potential check on e5. But rook g8 is actually a winning move. And let's just see why. So if check, and rook takes a7, and then bishop d7, you meet a check with a check. Or in this position, if pawn takes, then you win the queen and you play f3. And mate next move. But Aronian had realised with f6 and rook a6 he has a defence, and white is still alright in this position. The queen came back to g7. It still looks hopeless for white, but in fact Rook h6 saves. So you give up the rook temporarily. Now, got to be careful with black. If you shuffle to the wrong square, then there could be a check and taking here, or at the very least a perpetual, or maybe a check here and taking on h4. So queen g7. And here, running short of time, I think Aronian makes a mistake. I suspect he overlooked a little tactic here. So in the game, just let me show you what happened in the game, and that's queen takes and knight h4. So they reach this endgame where black has a big advantage. But in fact, in this position, Aronian could have played knight takes knight. And just compare these two positions. Now, in the game, Aronian's knight was stuck on h4. In this version, the knight is on e5, and I think that should be sufficient for white to draw the game. Still better for black because of the bishop, because of the passed a pawn, but I think white should hold. But in the game, let's just see what happened. a5. Now, black is obviously in the driving seat here. This is really difficult with the passive rook. Knight not very good, and now black's king storming in. Remember, Carlsen only needs a draw, but of course he wanted to press for the win. Here probably the best move is to play bishop d1 and to just lock that in on b3. But king e5, still better for black. And now knight g6 should be played, just getting the getting the knight back into play. I suspect that Aronian had seen that this would just, well, at the very least, simplify for black. I mean, black is never going to lose this position. There's still winning chances, but white should hold that position. But no chance to win. But I suspect that's why he played f3 to stop the rook coming down. But the problem is this knight is now really short of squares. King e5 already is very strong, so just go over and take the knight. Bishop e8 is still winning. And there was a last chance here to simplify with g3. Actually, let's just show that. That's a nice tactic. And this is typical of what you can do with the knight, of course. Of course, if g2, you've got knight e3 to pick up the pawn. Black is still much, much better in this position. Possibly even winning. But that's white's best defense. But in the game, after king c4, knight f5 played, and now it's grim. Rook a6, excellent move from Carlsen, and this just starts to restrict the knight. And now it is completely trapped. All those squares are covered by bishop and rook. And now Magnus brought the king back, and well, he's just going to take that knight in a couple of moves. The rook is still completely stuck out on a3. So, I mean, I know it's a bit unfair to analyse a blitz game. Actually, I think Carlsen played extremely well. I would say, you know, his accuracy was very good in this game. Aronian as well, actually, when he got to this position where, with black's attack, he looks completely lost. He found a series of only moves to actually get himself back in the game. But in the end, it wasn't enough, and the whole trend was in Carlsen's favour. Psychologically, it must have been incredibly difficult for Levon to come back from this classical game where he missed a win. But wow, we've seen it time and time again. Carlsen fighting to the bitter end. In this case, the bitter end to hold a draw, and then to actually win this Armageddon game afterwards. Fantastic performance. There are actually 2 wins in the classical games today. Fabiano Caruana and Shakhriar Mamedyarov won their classical games. So not everyone went to Armageddon. Anyway, thanks for watching.